Part II. Combray. Section 10. Although Saturday, by beginning an hour earlier, and by depriving her of the services of Françoise, passed more slowly than other days for my aunt, yet the moment it was past and a new week begun, she would look forward with impatience to its return, as something that embodied all the novelty and distraction which her frail and disordered body was still able to endure. This was not to say, however, that she did not long at times for some even greater variation, that she did not pass through those abnormal hours in which one thirsts for something different from what one has, when those people who, through lack of energy or imagination, are unable to generate any motive power in themselves, cry out, as the clock strikes or the postman knocks, in their eagerness for news, even if it be bad news, for some emotion, even that of grief, when the heartstrings, which prosperity has silenced like a harp laid by, yearn to be plucked and sounded again by some hand, even a brutal hand, even if it shall break them; when the will, which has with such difficulty brought itself to subdue its impulse, to renounce its right to abandon itself to its own uncontrolled desires and consequent sufferings, would fain cast its guiding reins into the hands of circumstances, coercive and, it may be, cruel. Of course, since my aunt's strength, which was completely drained by the slightest exertion, returned but drop by drop into the pool of her repose, the reservoir was very slow in filling, and months would go by before she reached that surplus which other people use up in their daily activities, but which she had no idea, and could never decide how to employ. And I have no doubt that then, just as a desire to have her potatoes served with béchamel sauce for a change would be formed, ultimately, from the pleasure she found in the daily reappearance of those mashed potatoes of which she was never tired, she would extract from the accumulation of those monotonous days, on which she so much depended, a keen expectation of some domestic cataclysm, instantaneous in its happening, but violent enough to compel her to put into effect, once for all, one of those changes which she knew would be beneficial to her health, but to which she could never make up her mind without some such stimulus. She was genuinely fond of us. She would have enjoyed the long luxury of weeping for our untimely decease. Coming at a moment when she felt well and was not in a perspiration, the news that the house was being destroyed by a fire, in which all the rest of us had already perished, a fire which in a little while would not leave one stone standing upon another, but from which she herself would still have plenty of time to escape without undue haste, provided that she rose at once from her bed, must often have haunted her dreams, as a prospect which combined with the two minor advantages of letting her taste the full savor of her affection for us in long years of mourning, and of causing universal stupefaction in the village when she should sally forth to conduct our obsequies, crushed but courageous, moribund but erect, the paramount and priceless boon of forcing her, at the right moment, with no time to be lost, no room for weakening hesitations, to go off and spend the summer at her charming farm of Mirougrin, where there was a waterfall. Inasmuch as nothing of this sort had ever occurred, though indeed she must often have pondered the success of such a manoeuvre as she lay alone absorbed in her interminable games of patience, and though it must have plunged her in despair from the first moment of its realization, from the first of those little unforeseen facts, the first word of calamitous news, whose accents can never afterwards be expunged from the memory, everything that bears upon it the imprint of actual physical death, so terribly different from the logical abstraction of its possibility, she would fall back from time to add an interest to her life, upon imagining other minor catastrophes which she would follow up with passion. She would beguile herself with a sudden suspicion that Françoise had been robbing her, that she had set a trap to make certain, and had caught her betrayer red-handed; and being in the habit, when she made up a game of cards by herself, of playing her own and her adversary's hands at once, she would first stammer out Françoise's awkward apologies, and then reply to them with such a fiery indignation that any of us who happened to intrude upon her at one of these moments would find her bathed in perspiration, her eyes blazing, her false hair pushed awry, and exposing the baldness of her brows. Françoise must often, from the next room, have heard these mordant sarcasms levelled at herself, the mere framing of which in words would not have relieved my aunt's feelings sufficiently, had they been allowed to remain in a purely immaterial form, without the degree of substance and reality which she added to them by murmuring them half aloud. Sometimes, however, even these counterpane dramas would not satisfy my aunt. She must see her work staged. And so, on a Sunday, with all the doors mysteriously closed, she would confide in Eulalie her doubts of Françoise's integrity and her determination to be rid of her. And on another day she would confide in Françoise her suspicions of the disloyalty of Eulalie, to whom the front door would very soon be closed for good. A few days more, and disgusted with her latest confidant, she would again be as thick as thieves with the traitor, while, before the next performance, the two would once more have changed their parts. But the suspicions which Eulalie might occasionally breed in her were no more than a fire of straw, which must soon subside for lack of fuel, since Eulalie was not living with her in the house. It was a very different matter when the suspect was Françoise, of whose presence under the same roof as herself my aunt was perpetually conscious, while for fear of catching cold, were she to leave her bed, she would never dare go downstairs to the kitchen to see for herself whether there was indeed any foundation for her suspicions. And so on by degrees, until her mind had no other occupation than to attempt, at every hour of the day, to discover what was being done, what was being concealed from her by Françoise. She would detect the most furtive movement of Françoise's features, something contradictory in what she was saying, some desire which she appeared to be screening; and she would show her that she was unmasked by a single word, which made Françoise turn pale, and which my aunt seemed to find a cruel satisfaction in driving into her unhappy servant's heart. And the very next Sunday a disclosure by Eulalie, like one of those discoveries which suddenly open up an unsuspected field for exploration, to some new science which has hitherto followed only the beaten paths, proved to my aunt that her own worst suspicions fell a long way short of the appalling truth. "But Françoise ought to know that," said Eulalie, "now that you have given her a carriage." "Now that I have given her a carriage!" gasped my aunt. "Oh, but I didn't know. I only thought so. I saw her go by yesterday in her open coach, as proud as Artaban, on her way to Roussainville Market. I supposed that it must be Madame Octave who had given it to her." So on by degrees, until Françoise and my aunt, the quarry and the hunter, could never cease from trying to forestall each other's devices. My mother was afraid lest Françoise should develop a genuine hatred of my aunt, who was doing everything in her power to annoy her. However that might be, Françoise had come more and more to pay an infinitely scrupulous attention to my aunt's least word and gesture. When she had to ask her for anything she would hesitate first, for a long time, making up her mind how best to begin. And when she had uttered her request, she would watch my aunt covertly, trying to guess from the expression on her face what she thought of it, and how she would reply. And in this way, whereas an artist who had been reading memoirs of the 17th century, and wished to bring himself nearer to the great Louis, would consider that he was making progress in that direction when he constructed a pedigree that traced his own descent from some historic family, or when he engaged in correspondence with one of the reigning sovereigns of Europe, and so would shut his eyes to the mistake he was making in seeking to establish a similarity by an exact and therefore lifeless copy of mere outward forms, a middle-aged lady in a small country town, by doing no more than yield whole-hearted obedience to her own irresistible eccentricities, and to a spirit of mischief engendered by the utter idleness of her existence, could see, without ever having given a thought to Louis XIV, the most trivial occupations of her daily life, her morning toilette, her luncheon, her afternoon nap, assume, by virtue of their despotic singularity, something of the interest that was to be found in what Saint Simon used to call the machinery of life at Versailles. and was able, too, to persuade herself that her silence, a shade of good humor or of arrogance on her features, would provide Françoise with matter for a mental commentary as tense with passion and terror as did the silence, the good humor, or the arrogance of the king when a courtier, or even his greatest nobles, had presented a petition to him, at the turning of an avenue at Versailles. One Sunday, when my aunt had received simultaneous visits from the Curé and from Eulalie, and had been left alone afterwards to rest, the whole family went upstairs to bid her good night, and Mamma ventured to condole with her on the unlucky coincidence that always brought both visitors to her door at the same time. "I hear that things went wrong again to day, Léonie," she said kindly. "You have had all your friends here at once." And my great aunt interrupted with, "Too many good things," for, since her daughter's illness, she felt herself in duty bound to revive her as far as possible by always drawing her attention to the brighter side of things. But my father had begun to speak. "I should like to take advantage," he said, "of the whole family's being here together, to tell you a story, so as not to have to begin all over again to each of you separately. I am afraid we are at Monsieur Legrandin's bad books. He would hardly say 'How do you do' to me this morning." I did not wait to hear the end of my father's story, for I had been with him myself after Mass when we had passed Monsieur Legrandin. Instead, I went downstairs to the kitchen to ask for the bill of fare for our dinner, which was of fresh interest to me daily, like the news in a paper, and excited me as might the programme of a coming festivity. As Monsieur Legrandin had passed close by us on our way from church, walking by the side of a lady, the owner of a country house in the neighborhood whom we knew only by sight, my father had saluted him in a manner at once friendly and reserved without stopping in his walk. Monsieur Legrandin had barely acknowledged the courtesy, and then, with an air of surprise as though he had not recognized us, and with that distant look characteristic of people who do not wish to be agreeable, and who from the suddenly receding depths of their eyes seem to have caught sight of you at the far end of an interminably straight road, and at so great a distance that they content themselves with directing towards you an almost imperceptible movement of the head, in proportion to your doll-like dimensions. Now, the lady who was walking with Legrandin was a model of virtue, known and highly respected. There could be no question of his being out for amorous adventure, and annoyed at being detected. And my father asked himself how he could possibly have displeased our friend. "I should be all the more sorry to feel that he was angry with us," he said, "because among all those people in their Sunday clothes, there is something about him, with his little cutaway coat and his soft neckties, so little dressed up, so genuinely simple, an air of innocence almost, which is really attractive." But the vote of the family council was unanimous, that my father had imagined the whole thing, or that Legrandin, at the moment in question, had been preoccupied in thinking about something else. Anyhow, my father's fears were dissipated no later than the following evening. As we returned from a long walk, we saw, near the Pont Vieux, Legrandin himself, who, on account of the holidays, was spending a few days more in Combray. He came up to us with outstretched hand. "Do you know, Master Book Lover," he asked me, "this line of Paul Dujardin? 'Now are the woods all black, but still the sky is blue.' Is not that a fine rendering of a moment like this? Perhaps you have never read Paul Desjardins. Read him, my boy, read him. In these days he is converted, they tell me, into a preaching friar, but he used to have the most charming water color touch. 'Now are the woods all black, but still the sky is blue.' May you always see a blue sky overhead, my young friend, and then, even when the time comes, which is coming now for me, when the woods are all black, when night is fast falling, you will be able to console yourself, as I am doing, by looking up to the sky." He took a cigarette from his pocket and stood for a long time, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Good by, friends!" he suddenly exclaimed, and left us. At the hour when I usually went downstairs to find out what there was for dinner, its preparation would already have begun, and Françoise, a colonel, with all the forces of nature for her subalterns, as in the fairy tales where giants hire themselves out as scullions, would be stirring the coals, putting the potatoes to steam, and, at the right moment, finishing over the fire those culinary masterpieces which had been first got ready in some of the great array of vessels, triumphs of the potter's craft, which ranged from tubs and boilers and cauldrons and fish kettles down to jars for game, molds for pastry, and tiny pannikins for cream, and included an entire collection of pots and pans of every shape and size. I would stop by the table where the kitchen maid had shelved them to inspect the platoons of peas, drawn up in ranks and numbered like little green marbles ready for a game. But what fascinated me would be the asparagus, tinged with ultramarine and rosy pink, which ran from their heads, finely stippled in mauve and azure, through a series of imperceptible changes to their white feet, still stained a little by the soil of their garden bed, a rainbow loveliness that was not of this world. I felt that these celestial hues indicated the presence of exquisite creatures who had been pleased to assume vegetable form, who, through the disguise which covered their firm and edible flesh, allowed me to discern in this radiance of earliest dawn these hinted rainbows, these blue evening shades, that precious quality which I should recognize again when, all night long after a dinner at which I had partaken of them, they played, lyrical and coarse in their jesting as the fairies in Shakespeare's dream, at transforming my humble chamber into a bower of aromatic perfume. Poor Giotto's Charity, as Swann had named her, charged by Françoise with the task of preparing them for the table, would have them lying beside her in a basket, sitting with a mournful air, as though all the sorrows of the world were heaped upon her, and the light crowns of azure which capped the asparagus shoots above their pink jackets would be finely and separately outlined, star by star, as in Giotto's fresco are the flowers banded about the brows, or patterning the basket of his Virtue at Padua. And meanwhile Françoise would be turning on the spit one of those chickens, such as she alone knew how to roast, chickens which had wafted far abroad from Combray the sweet savor of her merits, and which, while she was serving them to us at table, would make the quality of kindness predominate for the moment in my private conception of her character. The aroma of that cooked flesh, which she knew how to make so unctuous and so tender, seeming to me no more than the proper perfume of one of her many virtues. End of Part 2, Section 10,